Okay, thank you all for joining us today. I'm happy to say that this is excited to say that this is the final sustainability event for the ASHRAE New York committee this year. Our year ends in June, so starting next year there'll be a new board, new committee chairs, et cetera, et cetera. I strongly encourage anyone that's interested in participating and organizing these events from going on forward to go on to ashraenewyork.org. And check out the new Board of Governors list and reach out to some folks whose committees you may be interested in attending. Just some administrative notes for tonight. For all of you who are here for PDH credits, which I believe is a good portion of you, after you close out from the webinar tonight, after its completion, it's going to launch a survey with some information about your name, your workplace, your PE number, et cetera. You need to fill that out to receive your PDH credit. So again, once you close the GoToMeeting webinar at the end of the event tonight, there's going to be a survey that gets launched. If you want to receive your PDH credit, you're going to have to fill that survey out, and then the PDH credit will be emailed to you in very short order. Tonight's webinar is going to be recorded. So if you want to come back, if you want to revisit some of the slide content that will be available to you, Q&A is strongly encouraged. And I believe Marc is going to follow up with some reiterating points on that. But please use the chat function, put the chat in at any time during the Q&A session of the event, which is going to follow a few slides. Our organizers are going to be happy to answer any of those questions that you may have had during their presentations, or even in response to other questions that have come up during the Q&A portion. So with that, I'm going to fade into the background, and I will hand it right over to Marc Rauch, who is from the Environmental Defense Fund, and he is moderating tonight's event for us. So again, thank you all very much for attending.
Thank you, Ed, and welcome to all who are participating in today's panel discussion. It's become a commonplace to say that we live in extraordinary times, but here we are, finally emerging from a pandemic that, beyond its obvious public health consequences, has changed the way we live, work, play, and even the way we attend panel discussions. For people who are concerned with sustainability and the built environment, and by that I mean not just engineers, architects, and consultants, but also building owners, managers, and tenants, city and state sustainability officials, and not-for-profit sustainability advocates, like my organization, the Environmental Defense Fund. One of the most surprising and puzzling things about the pandemic has been the energy performance of commercial office buildings. Today, we have an outstanding panel of experts who will explain to us what has happened during the pandemic, provide insights into the reasons why it happened, and identify lessons that can be applied now as the pandemic continues to ebb, people gradually return to their offices, and our office buildings approach something resembling normal occupancy levels again. I'm going to briefly introduce our four panelists now in the order that they will speak. John Gilbert is Chief Operating Officer, Executive Vice President, and Chief Technology Officer of Rudin Management Company. The Rudin organization, as many of you know, is the largest and certainly one of the leading privately held real estate companies in New York City. John has been involved in every major Rudin development project in the last 25 years. He has a national reputation as an industry thought leader in the integration of technology into the built environment. As a co-inventor of the Nantum Building Operating System and executive chairman of Prescriptive Data, his vision is to future-proof real estate by giving every building a brain. Chris Colasanti is associate partner at Jaros, Baum, and Bolles, commonly known as JB&B, one of our top engineering firms. Chris leads the energy group and the deep carbon reduction team at JB&B, where he helps clients meet legal mandates and their own sustainability goals through cost-effective energy efficiency and capital improvement strategies. Chris has a degree in mechanical engineering from Penn State. He's a licensed professional engineer and active participant in the Council on Tall Buildings in the Urban Habitat. He works to design building systems that maximize efficiency and sustainability best practices while improving the health and well-being of the building's occupants. Zach Wills is a project engineer in the energy group at JB&B. He has worked on numerous new construction projects as well as existing buildings in the commercial, residential, healthcare, and life science sectors. Zach has a degree in mechanical engineering from Columbia and a degree in applied mathematics from Fordham. He has leadership roles in ASHRAE's New York chapter and in the Urban Green Council. UBS is not only a worldwide financial powerhouse, but also a major office tenant at 1285 Avenue of the Americas in Midtown Manhattan. Therefore, we are fortunate to have with us today Lee Vasilis, who serves as Regional Environmental Manager for UBS in the Americas. Lee joined UBS's environmental management team in 2014. Since then, he has been working to reduce UBS's carbon footprint from building operations across 300 locations and 8 million square feet. Lee's BA is from Grinnell, a hidden gem of a small college in central Iowa. Thanks to the magic of virtual meeting platforms, Lee is joining us today from Los Angeles. John, Chris, Zach, and Lee, thanks for being with us today. After we hear from each of our panelists, I will open the Q&A with a few questions of my own. Then we will take questions from the audience. As Ed pointed out, the questions are really important to the success of our program. Please put your questions in the chat at any time during today's program. John Gilbert will start the presentations with you.
Greetings, everybody. John Gilbert here from 345 Park. Why don't we go to the next slide? Marc was kind enough to give an introduction, so I'm not going to take that any further, and I want to thank Ed for his comments as well. I'm going to be showing you some data that we use day in and day out. As Marc mentioned, it's a system called Nantum. Nantum is derived from an ancient Algonquin word that means prayer or blessing, and the ability to grab data, see it, correlate it, truly is a blessing and has answered our prayers because it allows us to really focus on data-driven decision-making throughout the Rudin portfolio. This first graph we're looking at shows what was going on the week before or 2 weeks before the governor issued his stay-at-home mandate. As you can see across the portfolio, and that orange line is the total occupancy of the Rudin portfolio, roughly 10 million square feet of office. And we're on average on a typical day up above 20,000 people, usually 22, 23,000 people. As you can see, that March 7th week, that was a pretty normal week. You can also see that it was, it was going down during that week. Monday and Tuesday were higher clearly than Wednesday, Thursday, and then Friday. And then that Monday, people came into work pretty typical, a little bit down from the week before. But then you can see that third week in the March 21st when the governor said stay home, it was people left. Our occupancy numbers went down. And many people have talked about this concept of well, why didn't electricity and electric demand relate to occupancy? And if you go to the next slide, we can see that in fact this is the same period. So that first week is the March 7th, second week March 14th, and then that third when the governor said, okay, everybody stay home, this pandemic is real and it's hitting New York. Electric demand, and we measure our we look at electric demand because it's in real time and we can influence it. What we do is we take our occupancy data, we overlay it on top of of our electric demand so that we can ultimately deliver a level of comfort that is equal to the occupancy in the building. And I think as you see that third week, we only dropped about 30% in terms of electric demand. And I think it's important to note that there's a huge difference between an unoccupied building and a vacant building. All of us as property owners had to meet our lease mandates in terms of air conditioning, lighting, all of the services that we provide to our tenants, we couldn't walk away from. And so in effect, this unoccupied building still had to push, a significant amount of electric demand to ultimately meet our lease requirements, even though we went from 23,000 people to around 5,000 people and in that third week. And you can see here all of those, the rainbow of colors on the bottom of that graph are the cumulative, or add up to the orange graph, which is the cumulative portfolio total electric demand across the Rudin portfolio. You can go to the next slide, please. Here we're looking at 345 Park. Now pre-COVID, you can see this building is basically a 6 megawatt building. The green is representative of electric demand. The orange is occupancy. I've always found it interesting that there was roughly 6,000 people and 6,000 kilowatts. So each of us is represented equally based upon the amount of heat load that we give off and the air conditioning that's required to cool that, and then ultimately the plug load that we use for lighting and computers and servers. As you look at the pre-COVID and then compared to the COVID, after that March 21st, you can see that our occupancy went from 6,000 to 600, but ultimately electric demand didn't decrease much at all. Again, that 30% or so number. And again, it goes back to these buildings were unoccupied, they weren't vacant. We had tenants paying us rent that deserved the level of service that we had to meet in order to do that. I think it's also important, and I think other speakers will get into this later on in the presentation, is that there's an enormous amount of server computer power that needs to stay on in order to support a work from home strategy, and ultimately as people were working home. People need to access files. People need to ultimately, maybe some were coming in to pick things up. So there was definitely a requirement ultimately to meet this, the electric demand in order to keep servers cool and lights on. You can go to the next slide. So this, I think, is interesting because this is our real-time carbon GHG emission graph. And what it shows is the green line, or the green bar. You can see might be hard to see it on the lower one, but that's the real-time GHG emission production across our portfolio. Actually, I'm sorry, this is for 345 Park. The orange bar is where we need to be to meet the caps for 2024 in Local Law 97. And then blue is ultimately where we need to be in 2030. So as you can see, we're in pretty good shape from the standpoint to meet the requirements of that law. And again, this was 2020, so this was not full occupancy, but we're feeling pretty good in terms of meeting those caps. But what's important here is that we want our engineers to really see in real time what electric demand equates to when you convert it to GHG emissions. I think it's very, very important to get inside the brain of our operators that we're not only concerned about electric demand, we're not only concerned about delivering comfort, utilizing the least amount of energy possible, but we're also obviously very concerned in terms of the GHG emissions that we produce. Go to the next slide. So here, Nantum is basically showing us occupancy this last March. And you can see we're inching our way up, nowhere near where we need to be. This week's we're up another 25%. Next week will be even higher as more and more people come back to work. But the point here is that how important it is to monitor your occupancy in real time, and then use that data ultimately to correlate against electric demand, so that as we do deliver comfort, we're utilizing the least amount of energy possible. And that's the overall portfolio. And here we have electric demand, which reflects that. So, you know, we're getting up to, you know, 16 megawatts across the portfolio. You can see obviously all these buildings are cumulative, and you can also see our base load is pretty constant across the portfolio. You can go to the next slide. That's it. So just to sum up, you've got to be able to, you know, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. That's an old saying. I think, you know, the folks, the ASHRAE team is clearly a team that understands that. So focus on your data, make sure your data is in real time, make sure you're sharing this data not only with the people who are running the buildings, but the people who occupy the buildings as much as you possibly can. Because ultimately, if we cannot give data and share data to our customers to allow them to have their employees modify their behavior to ultimately decrease consumption, then we're never going to get to the 2030 caps in any way, shape, or form. So thank you all very much. Happy to answer questions later.
Hello. It's nice to see everyone here. Thank you all. I would like to thank all the attendees for giving their Tuesday evening to a talk about energy in buildings. I feel privileged just to get to talk to you here today. So I'm going to tell you a story about something that matters very deeply to me, and that is the electricity usage in office spaces while they are unoccupied. This is a story that begins in January of 2020 and continues all the way to this day. This is the result of a year-long study that was partially funded by NYSERDA, and we're just wrapping it up now. So just a caveat, any data that you might see is not final yet. So we're tasting the cake before we finish baking it, but it tastes pretty good. So if we could go to the next slide, I would just like to do a few very quick acknowledgements. First of all, like I said, to the NYSERDA Commercial Tenant Program for their partial funding of this project. And then to ASHRAE New York for hosting this event. It's great to get to talk about these problems. And finally, special thank you to the Nantum platform. That was an invaluable tool in our process. And so I just want to give credit where credit is due, talking about what knowledge can do. I think what I'm about to show you is definitely an example of that. So if we go to the next slide, we can define the problem. So here we can see a graph of the electricity consumption of a commercial office space. It's about 40,000 square feet. This is the JB&B office space. And this graph runs from the beginning of March of 2020 through the end of April. And so you can see here, we're pulling about 70 kW when we're occupied. That's on the left, spoiler alert, occupancy changes, but on the left you can see our full power draw at about 70, and then the current minimum load, that's around 28 kW. So after everyone goes home, that's how much power is still getting used by the equipment in our office. So if we go to the next slide very quickly, what we'll see is the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. And what that did was that kind of changed the game a bit, because we first of all had to like recontextualize our study, but more importantly, all load became unoccupied load for the duration of the year. And so that 28 kW now is a much more glaring number when it's not just happening after the last person leaves and the first person comes in the next day. So that's the definition of our problem. The next slide will get into the approach we took to try and address this. So if we could just go, perfect. So again, it's a 40,000 square foot office. What we did was dispatch smart plugs to monitor the electric loads of all of the different types of equipment throughout our office so that we could take that 28 kW and break it apart and name everything that's contributing to it. And so that was a exciting and kind of challenging process that we accomplished between January and March of 2020. Luckily, we got all our data gathered because we had an unexpected end to that period of data gathering. But so we gathered all the data, and then if we go to the next slide, we can see what makes up that 28 kW, and then we can start getting into how we can reduce it. So the pie chart on the left here shows 4 main categories of commercial office power consumption. The largest by far are the computers. We'll talk about what we can do to reduce that load. And then we also have the servers, other office equipment, and lighting. You can see the pie chart breaks out what comprises that other office equipment. Now, our initial hypothesis was that equipment would be higher, but this is what the results showed. And so we'll talk about ways of reducing power for other office equipment, and then we'll briefly touch on servers and lighting. We won't touch on today. That's a bit of a separate conversation. So if we can go to the next slide, let's take a look at what we can do first in a commercial office setting as the tenant to reduce the office equipment power. I've changed the coloring on the breakout of equipment here so that only one thing is blue, and that's the refrigerators. And really, that's because out of this equipment, the refrigerators are the one thing that we really don't want to turn off at night for pretty obvious reasons. But what we saw are that there are some other pretty significant contributions to the other equipment totals. And we can target those loads with either applications of controlled receptacles or smart plugs that can apply a schedule based on occupancy and therefore remove that unoccupied electricity load. Okay, so that's talking about 10% of the overall pie. Let's talk about the major contributor here. Let's talk about the computers. That'll be on the next slide. Oh gosh, sorry everyone. This is what happens when you have a graph that has about 6,000 data points in it. So Ed, I think we need to go back a few. So what we'll be seeing, I'll describe it quickly so that we have the stage set. What we'll be seeing is that same power usage graph. Here it is. But over a period of time that now stretches from February till the end of the year 2020. And overlaid on that is the number of laptops that our office is using. When the pandemic hit, we were required to kind of take the appropriate measures as soon as possible. And in order to work remotely, what we had to do was enable employees to virtually log in to their desktop computers. And that, since computers are 75% of that total load, it kind of became pretty clear that by converting our computer population from desktop computers to laptops, we can target that unoccupied electricity load and start getting some reduction. And so over the course of the summer of 2020, that's exactly what we did. We started switching out people's desktop computers for laptops that they could use at home, and by creating a more flexible workspace among all of our population of employees, we increased that percentage of laptops. And what you can see there is a direct correlation of that number of laptops versus the amount of power that we're consuming while unoccupied. This is a process. I mean, it's a process that's in progress, and we're working on it. But I think it's pretty clear that we can strike at that overall usage when we convert to laptops like this. And I think in the questions that we have later, we'll talk a little bit more about what hybrid work looks like. This is the kind of thing that makes that hybrid work an energy saving measure in addition to productivity measure. So if we go to the next slide, we'll touch on what we can do to target the servers, and then we'll do a conclusion. So virtualizing servers is pretty hard. We want to do it, and we're in the process of doing it, but the thing is that it takes a while. The idea here is that you can take the data that lives on your servers in your office and instead have it hosted on a cloud server. So you basically transport that data, and then you actually can create more usable square footage because your IT room suddenly is available. Now, I don't have data on that yet because we haven't been able to measure the impacts of that process in our office. But since this is a data-driven presentation, we don't have a cool graph on this one. But the theoretical limit of how much energy you can save by doing that is relatively clear, because it's when you remove the servers, that whole load is gone, and so you can convert that directly into potential energy savings. So now we'll just go quickly to the last slide, and we'll see this is the highlighted section there is just our floor in our building from a screenshot from Google Maps. So this is one floor, and this is an equivalent available reduction of almost 30 tons CO2 and 100,000 kWh over the course of an entire year. Now, if we look at just the other buildings that are included in that picture, there's a lot of floors there. And so the moral of the story is, like, this is one tenant in one building, but this is an opportunity that we can start working towards in so much more space. So thank you. I hope I didn't go too long. And I am excited for everyone's questions coming up.
Hello, everyone. So I just wanted to say thank you to Marc and to Ed and everyone here at ASHRAE as well for having me on today. Very happy to be here and contribute to the conversation. Again, my name is Lee Zappas. I want to start out by saying that I'm a history major, so I hope all you engineers won't hold that against me. It is important to note, as Marc stated at the top, I'm in-house environmental manager for UBS's Americas region. So I'm not part of the critical systems or facilities management teams at our New York City headquarters at 1285 Avenue of the Americas, but I do work closely with those teams and other teams around the region to reduce carbon footprint from our building operations. Just without, getting into too much detail or veering too much off track, those responsibilities include, managing a regional ISO 14001 certified environmental management system, ISO 14064 accredited greenhouse gas data capture and verification process, performance against measured environmental targets, legal regulatory compliance, and regional awareness, environmental awareness efforts across 300 plus locations in the Americas. Today, I'm going to walk through a couple slides and talk about our electricity consumption and headcount at 1285 Avenue of the Americas in 2019 and 2020, so before and during the pandemic. So Ed, okay to move to the first slide. So one note, as we dig into this, you'll see that I have not included any kWh or headcount units to measure, as UBS does not publicly report these figures at the building level. We do have annual reporting that provides kind of a more of a macro view. Hopefully that won't be too much of a hindrance. I think the relative trends should be easy to spot and help drive our conversation even without the actual numbers. So first thing we'll note on this slide, this is 1285's kWh consumption in 2019 before COVID. We could see some relative spikes in July and October, and then of course on the ends in December and January, all points that I think make sense in the normal course of business pre-COVID. And we can move to the next slide, please. So we'll layer in here our head count for 2019 against 2019 kWh. I want to point out that these are badge swipes, so these relative numbers are indicative of actual boots on the ground. While there's not necessarily an exact correlation between the two numbers, I think we could see a reasonable correlation between headcount and consumption. For instance, you see a dip and then a rebound in both kWh and headcount numbers between relative spikes in July and October. One other thing to note is that the timing of electricity bills and the dates, when those meter readings are taken, can sometimes not correlate exactly with the average monthly badge swipes. The readings are never taken, on exactly the first or last day of the month or whatever. We might also look at this graph and deduce that kWh readings are lagging about a month behind the badge swipes, maybe just a couple weeks. So okay to move to the next slide. So 2020 headcount. So on this slide, we've layered that in. We can clearly see the expected results, big dip in 2020 headcount in April after COVID hits. And then we see that dip remains relatively constant throughout the rest of the year. The punchline, of course, is on the next slide. So Ed, you can move us there. So on this fourth and final slide, we can see the illustration of the conundrum. Headcount plummets, kWh doesn't really fall off the cliff in the same manner. Why? So first thing, obviously, is we've kind of begun to state already, the building doesn't close, right? It remains open and operational. Additionally, we have IT loads in our data center and equipment room that still need to be supported, and those do not necessarily change based on headcount occupancy. In the first couple months of the pandemic, we can see a notable drop in kWh in March, April, and May compared to the preceding months. Whereas consumption in 2019 remained relatively consistent during those first couple months after February. We can also see what looks like an oddity, a big spike in June 2020, followed by a drop in July and August. So that spike does not necessarily appear to correlate with any significant increase in headcount. So our engineering team believes that one factor contributing to this spike was the implementation of ASHRAE's higher ventilation standards for COVID in June. So to combat COVID and potentially any other airborne diseases that we may encounter in the future, we need to recirculate as much air as possible in our closed environment. So to do this, we want to increase ventilation and take in as much outside air as possible, which means what? It means we have to crank the heat to combat the cold in the winter, and it means we need to crank the cooling in the summer to combat the outside hot air coming in. So when the landlord opens up the fresh air dampers, bringing in that warm air into our environment, that meant we had to work harder to cool the environment and maintain that 72-degree target temperature. It might be worth noting 1285 that UBS only uses electricity for heating and cooling. We use an electric motor for a chiller plant, whereas our landlord uses steam to turn their chiller plant and also for heating. Second factor that may have contributed to that June spike would be the hot, humid weather that month. We can consider cooling degree days as a measure of how hot the temperature was on a given day or during a period of days. I'm sure everyone here is familiar with the concept, but for instance, a day with a mean temperature of 80 degrees Fahrenheit has 15 cooling degree days. If the next day is a mean temperature of 83, then that's 18 cooling degree days, and therefore you could sum the total for those 2 days as 33. So using that methodology, there were 132 cooling degree days in June 2020 versus only 85 back in June 2019. So that would factor in, year-over-year jump as well as the expected jump at the start of the summer season in 2020. Ultimately, we have to consider how many times we have to turn the compressors on in the summer or the boiler on in the winter or whatever to get the temperature where it needs to be. So we're, of course, always battling the glass building envelope. So constantly losing heat and cooling through our windows. The weird thing is that in July and August of 2020, the higher ventilation standards stayed in place. The weather was presumably still relatively hot and humid. The head count increased only modestly, but the electricity consumption went back down, relatively speaking. Perhaps one factor contributing to this outlier pattern in the middle of 2020 is that UBS traders were logging in remotely to their office desktops during the period. And June is a big reporting month for them, so leading potentially to some, more traders working longer hours in June and logging in remotely to their desktops for longer periods of time. Conversely, many traders are likely on vacation in July and August when electricity consumption went back down and not logging in remotely to their office desktops. One other factor to consider in all this is that we may ultimately not have enough granular data at the sub-meter level to more fully explain the pattern and provide any additional insights. We have about 850,000 square feet across 1285 across 19 floors. And while we do have sub-meters on some of those floors, some of the sub-meters cover multiple floors, making it harder to take a deeper dive into kind of what's going on. Certainly, at a minimum, more sub-meters with at least one sub-meter per floor would help tease out some of those, the causes of outlier dips or spikes in electricity consumption. While there would definitely be value in getting more granular monitoring, the rate of return is not necessarily, great compared to the cost of implementing such a solution. Ultimately, I think COVID and our operational requirements worked against us in trying to reduce electricity consumption. Like I mentioned, we needed to work harder to implement the ASHRAE higher ventilation standards. We needed to keep the building open for a variety of reasons, including partly for occupancy, obviously reduced occupancy, and partly to keep our data center and equipment room up and running to support our operations. Certainly one consideration could have been to centralize the limited number of people that were coming into the office on just a floor or two, giving us the ability to darken the majority of floors and consume less, but we ultimately decided that would have gone against the primary directive of keeping the employees as safe as possible. We opted to keep them spaced out across the different floors that they were already occupying. So hopefully that all makes sense. Happy to answer any questions as best I can at the appropriate moment, and I'll turn it back to the team here. Thanks.
Hi, everybody. Good evening. Chris Colasanti. First, Lee, I just want to say I don't hold it against you about your history major. Once you start getting into the cooling degree days and your work at 1285, it was clear that that obviously doesn't matter. So I'm going to tell my kid he can do whatever he wants. But thinking about these presentations today, looking at Zach's and John's and Lee yours, like there's a general theme here around, definitely around tenant energy use and what that means and sort of how things are moving with COVID, but it's also around data and sort of how we acquire data and then what we do with it. So my short presentation is about that topic. It's about data, but specifically about benchmarking and data, because I think there's a gap there that I want to talk about for a second. When we talk about building benchmarking, yeah, go to the next slide. Thanks, Ed. When we talk about building benchmarking, benchmarking is supposed to tell a story about a building. Your score, the letter grade, the A, the B, the C, the Energy Star score, they're supposed to tell us about how a building is actually performing. Its water use, its energy use, all those things overlaid on occupancy so that we can measure, we can understand, and hopefully make improvements to a building over time. But the benchmarking as it is today is very limited. Not only the laws themselves, the way we regulate it, but also the tools that we have to record the data themselves. I mean, if you think about the way we do Local 84 right now, it's literally, we have to manually enter information into the Energy Star Portfolio Manager. It's very laborious. It's very limiting. And it's also limiting because, we're only looking at data in large increments, in monthly increments, total consumption, total energy and water use for each month, and, an estimated occupancy. And so it's helpful, it's good information, and it does allow us to create these Energy Star scores and these, the letters and the numbers, but it's not really telling us what I think is the right story that we should be telling. When we look at these two buildings on the screen here, give it the next slide there, Ed. When we look at the two buildings on the screen, one of them has a very even energy use. It's flat during the day. And the other one has a peak, that one right around 4 o'clock, the one that's shaped like a triangle. And you say to yourself, which one of these is better? Which one's more efficient? And technically, they use the same amount of energy. The area under that line is the same for both of them. And so from a benchmarking perspective, the way it's viewed right now, those are equal. These two buildings are the same. They have the same Energy Star score because that total energy consumed is the same, but they're not the same. The building on the right is going to cost more to operate because of peak demand charges that were talked about earlier, and it's going to emit more carbon emissions because the energy use peaks when the grid is the dirtiest. So no, the one on the right I think is much worse than the one on the left. It's worse from a cost standpoint, it's worse from a carbon emission standpoint, but yet our benchmarking tool, Energy Star, and benchmarking in general sees them exactly the same. They would have the same score, the same letter grade, and the same EUI. Somebody asked me the other day, what the EUI of a project was. What is the EUI for this building? I want to benchmark it against something else. And I'm saying that I don't think EUI is the right measure for a building, because measuring EUI on an annual basis per square foot doesn't really tell us how the building is actually performing, which is so important based on everything we just talked about. Go to the next slide, Ed. When we look at how things actually perform, right, we're seeing, just like we saw before, every hour is different and every hour means something. If we want to move toward a real improvement, we can't be measuring the once per month or once per year, because with that lens, we're not capturing actually how buildings perform. And I think we need to do better. And so I'm advocating kind of here, and we have a project kind of with NYSERDA right now where we're testing this out. We're advocating to move toward benchmarking on an hourly basis, and having those benchmarking tools evolve to accept that hourly information. If you can go to the next slide. Because when we look at a building for real, right, when we look at it, we see that, what we saw with John from Nantum, just the data from before, and Lee, right, we need to measure hourly and get that information in a database so we can really understand what's going on. Instead of benchmarking with assumed occupied hours, right, which is how we do it today, we should be using actual hours. Instead of looking at estimated occupants, which are maybe from turnstile data, but maybe not, right? We should be using real data, real actual in and out kind of information. And instead of monthly energy, which is very broad to realize any conclusions, I'm recommending to use hourly energy, and the same for weather. If you can go to the next slide. And so from there, once you understand how things are performing on an hourly basis, you can make smarter decisions about peak demand reduction, which impact grid infrastructure, which is a huge topic right now with electrification of heating systems. And you can help the bottom line because of those demand charges, especially in the summer. And having those hourly insights, we can justify better long-term solutions like energy storage, which are going to be necessary for electrifying heating in the long run. And coming back to energy use in the tenant space, we saw from the other presentations how occupancy and energy are related to each other, but not in the way we thought. I think everybody assumed that the energy use was going to drop off a cliff when the occupancy did. And so having more hourly information in different individual systems, like what Zach did for all the individual loads, is going to help us understand exactly what's happening, why those spaces and energy use are behaving the way they are, and then allow us to figure out which levers to pull and which things need to move to make reductions in energy use. If you go to the next one, please. And so in summary, I think that our current assessment tools, ESPM, is very simplified and overly simplified and doesn't capture the dynamic nature of building performance. And our policies that regulate buildings, Local Law 97, for example, doesn't recognize or respond to or reward responsive buildings, the ones that do adjust their loads in real time with energy storage and demand reduction. And so this has been a huge criticism of Local Law 97, right? The fact that if you put in ice storage in your building, for example, and reduce your peak demand, it actually impacts your carbon emissions, your bottom line at the end of the year because of that yearly measurement time frame. That whole Local Law 97 thing we can talk about in the Q&A, or it could be a whole separate discussion for another day. Obviously, there's a lot to go into there. And so, look, I think we can do better. The technology exists, products like Nantum that we just saw to monitor buildings in real time. And I think with those products that are out there, we can have the benchmarking tools evolve. The databases evolve to capture the information in a better way, to accept this hourly and this more detailed data. And then from there, we can be able to compare buildings and spaces and tenant spaces in a real fair way. Develop a standard such that we can really understand which buildings and spaces are performing better or worse. And use that information to make better decisions about systems to install, things to upgrade and change so that you can reduce your bottom line and attract tenants and reduce carbon emissions. That's it. And I think we're going to go back to Marc now, right? Marc, should I just stick on here? We're going to do the Q&A, right?
Yes, I think everybody's going to come on for the Q&A. Everybody should activate their camera. Again, I would encourage everyone who's watching to put their questions in the Q&A function, and so that we can we can ask the panelists questions relating to these wonderful presentations that they've just made. And they really have been terrific. So I'm going to start off the Q&A. And I'll ask the panel members just to jump in as they see fit, if they're inspired to answer any of these questions that I'm about to ask. So first off, I want to ask the panelists, what's the single most important lesson about energy management that commercial tenants, or landlords for that matter, should have learned from the office sector's energy performance during the pandemic?
I mean, I guess I can start with that one, Mark. Number one, it's get your arms around your data. I mean, what we just saw, what we just witnessed in terms of what Lee was talking about, what Chris is talking about, what Zach is talking about, is the power of granular data. We need to get floor by floor data in order to really attack the carbon issue. If we don't get it, I mean, look at what Zach just did. He basically dissected the consumption pie and the electric demand pie of a tenant. And if we can really zero in on that and begin to virtualize servers, boom, that's a huge chunk of that load that we can eliminate, simply eliminate. And if owners and tenants work together, ultimately to really share data, hey, look what I've got. Hey, look what you got. Now suddenly you're really beginning to attack the problem. So get your arms around your data. It's got to be in real time, because you can't have a 30-day look back and expect to solve problems in real time. And that's literally why we created Mantle and why other owners are using it, because they see the value in it.
Mark, can I jump in here for a second? It's okay.
Sure.
I think, John, it's a really good point about the data. And Zach, I think we focused on the electrical data, right? The plug loads and the servers and everything. I'm really curious about the HVAC loads. And obviously, Zach did a study on electrical. It's really interesting to me, John, I think you showed this in your presentation, Lee, it's in yours as well, that, that the base building energy, HVAC energy, doesn't look like it changed very much. And so, Mark, thinking about your lesson about, what have we learned, and I think, what can we do? Like, I guess I have to think that better control over HVAC that can respond to occupancy, we might have seen a different dip there. And that's hard and that's expensive and that's complex. But I kind of wanted to just tee that up as an idea. Which I'm sure
Chris, how do you do that?
Well, you're looking at individual, the more granular control you can get, whether it's a VAV with individual control of a conference room or a space, and you can shut that VAV off with occupancy sensors, or whether it's a more specific, schedule, adjustments of set points, temperature set points, as granular as you can get. The more granular you get, the more energy savings I think you're going to see. I think the challenge there, I'd like to hear from John and Lee. I mean, I know that there's leasing challenges with that too. That from a technical engineering standpoint, yeah, let's throw in more controls, let's throw in more zones to give more control. But I don't even know if that's a completely feasible approach.
Well, we're doing it 40 East 52nd Street right now with a large financial customer of ours, and literally the DX unit, and it's a DX building, so it's floor by floor. But until and when an individual occupant of the 16th floor is actually swiping their card to get through the turnstile, that DX unit's not turning on upstairs. And what was fascinating about it, when we began to look at the data and share the data, the tenant came to us and said, hey, you're showing us that my people aren't arriving until quarter to 9 in the morning. Why are you giving me conditioned air at 7 a.m.? We're like, well, that's what you negotiated. And they're like, well, then let's do a letter agreement and get rid of that requirement. 2 thumbs up. That's awesome. And what about Saturdays when you got all 16 floors that are pushing conditioned air from 9 to 1? Well, we want to do a hot desking floor. Let's only put it on 1 floor or 2 floors. Boom, beautiful. But unless you have the data and unless you're willing to share it, you can never have the conversation.
Have you guys found that tenants are looking for more data? I mean, I know, Lee, you guys are a pretty big, sophisticated tenant. John, I'm just curious, like, are folks asking now, or is it still like sort of, don't ask, don't want to know kind of thing?
Lee, you want to go?
I guess I would say we're, always, as we've mentioned a few times, having the data is always going to be something that we're looking for, striving for. Clearly, we could use more data from a sub-metering perspective. Yeah, I mean, we're not saving as much energy as we would have assumed, and then we have to kind of figure out, where that problem lies, and then kind of how to address that. Yeah.
What we're seeing, what's going to drive this is, Lee's CEO X of X company stands up in front of the market and says, we're going carbon neutral. We're going carbon net zero. And then suddenly they turn to Lee and say, hey, how the hell, how are we gonna do that, Lee? And Lee's first call has got to be to the owner, because in most cases, we're the procurer of that energy. And so what we then say is, okay, the first thing you got to do, because you got to first use less, and then you got to go find how to buy, renewable energy that's actually delivered into Zone J in order to meet the mandates of Local Law 97. There's nothing coming into the Zone J right now, zero. There's some community stuff happening, but it's very little. So that immediately forces data exchange, and immediately forces the concept of how do we get river run hydro from upstate New York delivered into Zone J? How do we get wind coming off of Long Island Sound delivered into Zone J? And how do we get more solar? That's the conversation we've got to have.
Yeah, I think that's been certainly our biggest challenge at 1285 from a renewable energy standpoint. UBS does have a net zero carbon commitment for 2025 from Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, and we are 100% renewable. We do have a couple of interesting deals. We struck a deal from a Pennsylvania wind farm to power up our tower in Chicago and our campus in Lincoln Harbor and Weehawken. But the vast majority of that is really ultimately unbundled renewable energy credits, which is not great. One of our greatest missions at the moment is to try and find some kind of a better deal, a better product where we're able to kind of bring some additionality to the grid and actually trying to move the needle from that perspective.
John and Chris, picking up on the most recent answers, for Local Law 97, Local Law 33, the building letter law, can you talk a little bit about what the energy profile is of a typical office building and what role the tenant plays in enabling the building as a whole to meet requirements or achieve either meet Local Law 97 targets or achieve a good letter grade? What role do tenants play in that?
It's huge. I mean, on average in our portfolio, 60% of every electron that is consumed is on the tenant. Only 40% is at core. I've got one building, 32 Ave Americas. It happens to be a very unique building. It's an internet building. That's where the cloud lives. That's where all the major carriers are. That building never sleeps. The ratio of tenant to owner consumption is 10 to 1. And somehow I'm supposed to, as owner, knock on everybody's door and say, okay, Mrs. McGillicuddy's not going to be able to email her kids or grandkids tonight because you got to shut down. That ain't happening. And yet the responsibility is on owner to solve that. It's an impossible job. So the point that you're making, Mark, which is a really good one, is, and I go back to what we just said, if you really zero in on what Zach, Lee, and Chris have said, that granular data, that sharing of that granular data with owner is the solution to what where we need to get to. If we don't do it, there's no way we can.
Yeah, and Marc, to your point in the last question about what we learned, we got one big data point that we never had before. This isn't like looking at 2018 to 2019 and seeing that 2019 was a bit hotter, it cost a little bit more. I think like the awareness has to come, but if we're going to learn something, it's going to be like why didn't it go down? It's going to be what we see from that data point. And I think what we're the whole purpose of this panel and what we're doing here right now is getting that word out, and I think we can't stop because we have like the proof like we haven't had before in order to demonstrate this need.
I mean, look who's on this. Look who's on this panel. We've got the Environmental Defense Fund. We've got a major international engineering firm, and we've got a huge global financial services company, and one of the largest privately owned owners of real estate. All of us want the same thing. All of us are environmentalists. All of us know that we've got to decrease consumption and increase the amount of renewables coming into Zone J. Full stop. Let's go do it.
There's